Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is considered a literary masterpiece, and similarly, it had an impact also on the big screen. Universal's 1931 film adaptation is just as iconic, and despite being nearly 100 years old, it remains popular to this day. This said, it wasn't the first film adaptation of the novel. It was actually the fourth. Sadly, the first three adaptations ended up being forgotten and lost, with only one of them being rediscovered. In this episode of Banned, Censored and Lost, we'll take a closer look at the first three films and the information we have about them. What many don't realize is that the design of Frankenstein's monster everybody knows is actually copyrighted by Universal. This was mainly possible due to Mary Shelley's book barely describing the monster's appearance and leaving it up to the reader's interpretation. In other words, Universal owns the following design: green skin, flat top head, a scar on the forehead, bolts on the neck, and a protruding forehead. So despite Mary Shelley's book being in the public domain for a very long time and everyone being able to use it in any way they want, you could end up in legal trouble in case you decide to depict Frankenstein's monster in your work in a way that it would resemble the 1931 film adaptation. And believe me, Universal took full advantage of this. But on the bright side, in 2027, the 1931 film will enter the public domain, so expect things to change. But going back to the first three films, as you could guess, the monsters in them had quite a different appearance than the one you are familiar with. The first Frankenstein film is from 1910 and is just around 12 minutes long. It's a silent film which has a very unique approach. They realized that the book's materials would be too much for the public back then. Films were a very new thing back then, and everything that wasn't bland as dishwater was seen as obscene, problematic. In other words, this film was intentionally made to strip it of its horror elements. Instead, it focused on the mystic and psychological elements. Due to this, the creature that Dr. Frankenstein creates in this film isn't the result of him bringing a corpse to life. And yes, it's the scientist whose name is Frankenstein, not the monster. That's a common misconception. Instead, the scientist wants to create the perfect human being and attempts this by mixing together chemicals in a special room, which then creates a human-like creature. But as it's been proven in fiction as well as reality, humans playing God doesn't bear the wished results, and instead a human-like abomination was created. In my personal opinion, it's the creator of the creature who's the real monster here. The creature then follows Frankenstein, although unlike in the original novel, it doesn't pose a big physical threat to people, aside from showing jealousy towards Elizabeth, Frankenstein's soon-to-be wife. In fact, the monster in this film is really more like a boogeyman. He torments Frankenstein by staying by his side and constantly reminding him of what he has done. Things don't change until Frankenstein finally confronts the monster by standing up to it and protecting his wife. At this point, the monster flees, goes into the room with the mirror, and begins to vanish into thin air, remaining only in the mirror. And when Frankenstein discovers this, much to his horror, the monster turns into his reflection. The initial shock of this does turn into a happy ending, as he and his wife hug now, and the nightmare is finally over. So indeed, this is very tame compared to the original book, and yet it was still too much for some people back in the day, since some raised the question what can be shown in the cinema. There are some claims that this film is banned, but I couldn't find any proof of that. There are however negative reviews from back then, which are very amusing to read in current times. Because let's be real, even children's programs have more darker elements today than many of the things people objected 100 years ago. Regardless, the film fell into obscurity and became lost for decades. It wasn't until the 1970s when a private collector revealed he has a copy after finding out that the film is considered lost. And his copy was the only surviving print of the film. He did hold on to the copy, but he did let some people see it on occasions and did release it onto DVD. And since then the film has been restored and can be found easily online. If you are interested in more details about the restoration of this film, there is a link in the description. So the first Frankenstein film was lucky, by pure coincidence, and it survived. The other two weren't, and they are now lost. The second film, based on Mary Shelley's novel, is Life Without Soul, made in 1915. The silent film is lost, but we do know what happens in it, since at least some things survived. We know that the film is 70 minutes long. We also have some stills from it, as well as a poster where we can see the main characters. And most importantly, we have a pamphlet with the full description of the film. The film isn't a direct adaptation of Mary Shelley's book, instead it uses it to tell a similar story. The main character here is Victor Frawley, who develops a life-giving fluid. Before he tests it, he is warned about the dangers by his family and friends and decides to read Mary Shelley's novel, but he falls asleep during it and he dreams about the story of the novel where he plays the main character. He uses the fluid on a clay statue, which is called the Creation in this film, and he creates a human-like monster which terrorizes him and murders people around him. The Creation demands that a mate is created for him, to which Victor agrees at first, but then he suspects that the creations might mate and populate the earth with their offspring, which could exterminate humanity. Due to this, Victor kills the female creation before she fully awakes, and this angers the first creation, who in return kills Victor's wife and also his best friend. The final climax of the film is about Victor chasing after the creation in a desert, and then he ends up dying of exhaustion. The creation then discovers his corpse and realizes that he too should pass into the great beyond. At this point, Victor finally wakes up, realizes the dangers of his elixir, and he disposes of it, before reuniting with the people who were killed in his nightmare, and he is very thankful that they are alive in the real world. Honestly, it's a very interesting concept, and it was praised back then, since the horror elements it showed was bypassed by making it clear that it's in a dream, in the prologue and as well as in the epilogue. And in case you're reading the synopsis on Wikipedia and are confused about my summary of the plot, the Wikipedia summary doesn't match neither the pamphlet nor the source it is citing. Then again, nothing new for Wikipedia. One final thing worth mentioning about this film is that it played a role in a lawsuit involving Universal. Remember earlier when I said that Universal took full advantage in regards to suing? Well, in 1931 they sued because another film under the title of Frankenstein was planned, and the film Life Without Soul was brought up during the case. Universal won and the project was scrapped. In case you're interested in more details, the link is in the description. And now we go to the last lost Frankenstein film in this video, Il Monstro di Frankenstein, or The Monster of Frankenstein. It's an Italian film from 1921, and it's a really odd one. There's not much that survives from this film, aside from a few reviews, one still image, and a movie poster. And yet it's a topic of discussion in regards to Italian films, since it is said to be the very first Italian horror movie. but conflicting information exists about what kind of genre the film was attempting to be. It also doesn't help that the film had problems with censors, with some versions of the film being severely cut. Apparently. As said, no known copies of this film exist, despite it being shown in several countries in Europe, as well as even in Egypt. The contemporary reviews say that it was a rather loose adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel, and in case you checked Internet Movie Database and saw this picture, it's not from this film, it's actually from the film The Man on the Comet from 1925, but it stars the same guy in both films, so maybe somebody got confused, but it's not from this film. So, these are the 3 Frankenstein films made before Universal made their timeless classic. I will also revisit Universal's Frankenstein in the future since it was subjected to censorship. But back to the first 3 films. All 3 are interesting in their own way. The first one survived by sheer luck, and the other 2 weren't that lucky sadly. At least so far. Will they ever be found, or are they lost forever? Who knows? Sadly, this kind of fate hit a lot of silent films due to carelessness in the past. Since then, preservation is taken more seriously, but it cannot undo the permanent damage that already happened. What are your thoughts on this subject? Write a comment, share this video, click thumbs up, everything helps with the algorithm.